Okay, so maybe I just start with something that an MP, Member of Parliament, said in 1900 in Britain when he was calling for more strict censorship. He said, young people today form most of their ideas from what they see in the theatre. It's obviously that's a pre-television age, pre-radio, so apart from press, theatre, he said, was where people got their ideas from. And that's why he was very keen for censorship actually to get tougher than it was. And why, for example, they were banning plays like Oedipus because of the theme of incest in Oedipus. By 1968, which is when that system of censorship is abolished, nobody could possibly have said that young people or any people were getting most of their ideas from the theatre. So in a sense, although that was never voiced as the reason, given as the reason why theatre censorship was no longer necessary in the same way, I think that's absolutely the subtext. Once the system of censorship in Britain was introduced in 1737, one of the requirements was that you had to submit a complete script, originally 14 days before the performance, and it became 7 days, and the actors were not, at least in theory, allowed to modify that text at all. So no improvisation was permissible on the stage. There's a point in 1950s where quite an enterprising director wants to stage some commedia dell'arte, the traditional Italian comedy that was depended largely on improvisation. And the Lord Chamberlain is actually quite sympathetic, but says there's nothing I can do. I can't allow this because the law requires that you submit the complete script and you don't change anything in it. Now, whether that always happened, I'm very doubtful. We know of examples, I know of examples where actors certainly did change lines, and there was no effective policing system to make sure that they never did. And even if a line had been cut, you know, the actor could always say it and could always say, oh, I didn't mean to say it, sorry, I'd learned it and I didn't manage to cut it tonight. So there were things like that where you could get around it.
In certain forms of theatre, and especially it's most notorious in opera, you have a form of almost censorship that's exercised by the audience in the sense that they would form into claques. And if it's thought that a particular composer is to be disliked, then they will hiss the performers off the stage, you know, or boo and clap and all that kind of thing. And there are rival claques that will go in that are almost like gangs, and favour or disfavour particular singers or particular performers or particular tunes, this kind of thing. And it's a quite complicated phenomenon. As far as I know, I've never actually been. I think there's something that almost is like the residue of that operates at La Scala still. I think it's the only place.
It's interesting that you bring up sort of 19th century audience culture, because in the United States we had what's called the Astor Place riot, which was a riot that was caused by Shakespeare performances. There was an actor, and I'm forgetting his names, but their names, if you look them up, they're on Wikipedia even. But there was one actor who was preferred by the nativist movement, people who wanted it to be American, and they claimed Shakespeare for America. And then there was a British Shakespeare actor. What happened was that the American people decided to go and destroy the other performance, and there was a riot, and people actually died. A theater burned down. So Shakespeare caused a riot in New York City in the 1800s.
So there's one of the plays that's often seen as having brought the censorship down in the 1960s was a play by Edward Bond called Saved, which is still a very shocking play. It has a scene in which a bunch of youths stone a baby to death in a pram in a park and then set fire to it because they've got nothing better to do. And it's to be licensed. The theatre that wants to do it is the Royal Court Theatre, which is a very famous, sort of well-established theatre. But the Lord Chamberlain actually says, I can't quote him exactly, but something like, the Royal Court audience will be all right watching this, but if another group of people get hold of this play and perform it to gangs of young men, who might be inspired to go out and do the same sort of act, then that's a reason why we mustn't license it.
It's also worth noting that at least one of the stated purposes of the Lord Chamberlain, so far as the Lord Chamberlain was concerned, was to stop the spread of fake news. It was to stop giving one-sided, non-representative versions of events, which could then cause riot, uprising, etc.
Right, and that has intersected with two things I've been thinking about through this discussion. One, the degree to which, unlike books or images, theater is very much pulling on the same challenges to government that freedom of assembly. It's a freedom of assembly question in addition to it being a freedom of speech question, because you have a group of people coming together in one place. So it has all of the narrative potential dynamism of a novel, but all of the social action dynamism of a protest, for example, or any kind of march or parade that is bringing a large number of people into one place, which is something that other literary forms don't generate and so don't grapple with in terms of the anxieties of the state.
Absolutely. And you see that again and again. It's stated that the ideas that someone might come across in a book on their own, sitting at home or in a library, will not affect them in the same way as if they are in a group of people, all of them getting the same ideas together from someone physically talking to them.
Right,
So in Britain, it's important to say that most theatre managers were in favour of the system of censorship by the Lord Chamberlain just for that reason, because it gave them protection. They got a licence, and if local people, particularly it applied to touring shows, but not only touring shows, if people started to complain and say, oh, we don't think you should be allowed to do that, some local organisation, some local society, individual, the theatre manager can say, look, it's approved by the Lord Chamberlain, who is a servant in the royal household. So effectively, it's been approved by the monarch.
Well, and this affects all sorts of performance, including music. I remember a friend of mine describing waking up one morning in her Manhattan apartment and hearing a bagpipe in the distance and walking toward it, enjoying the music, and then eventually getting within line of sight of the player who was in a park, who, upon seeing a human approaching, immediately stopped playing and picked up a piece of paper and waved it. I have a license! I have a license! because so often people try to shut down a bagpipe player outside. But that by having that licensing system, you have a protection at the same time that you have the censorship. And